Good morning. Welcome to day 3 of, actually, sorry, Ruth, I didn't mean to spotlight you. We just wanted to feature Ruth this morning and say thank you for being a volunteer. So you're joining us on day 3 of our Learn Free Conference 2023. And this morning we have Wendy Charles Warner, who is co-chairman of Education Otherwise, has home educated herself in the past and is heavily involved in supporting home educators around the country by the thousands. She runs one of the bigger groups on dealing with your local authorities, and has seen all sides, the good, the bad, and the ugly of local authorities and of home educating parents too, I might add. So Wendy is going to be speaking this morning about trust, the essential element, and I think that pertains to various areas, which we hope, we can, I think anybody watching will understand, as I have come to understand, just how important trust is in so many aspects to do with home education and in being free and empowered. It's vitally important. So I'm going to remove the spotlight of myself and hand over to Wendy. Thank you, Wendy.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us to listen to this session. As Juliet says, trust. What I'm going to talk to you about today is trust and how essential trust is in home education. And people will have their own ideas about what that means. But trust is all encompassing. The very first thing we have to think of is the parent. The parent who is deciding whether or not to home educate. When we listen to parents on a helpline, they often say to us, "Oh, I don't know if I'm clever enough. Oh, I don't know if I'll get this right." That parent isn't trusting themselves, they're doubting themselves. And parents shouldn't be doubting themselves. So the first aspect of trust is the parent needs to trust themselves. Now, what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is you've brought your child up to date. You have managed to get your child from being a very helpless, tiny little infant to being the capable, very beautiful, wonderful, and individual, independent little thing they are now. No matter what their age, you have actually been the person who has brought them to that stage. So clearly, as a parent, you have the skills to do what is right for your child. Your instincts are telling you that your child needs something different to what your child has now. And those instincts are really important, and you've got to trust them. There is no such thing as a parent who is insufficiently intelligent to home educate their child, because that's not how home education works. You need to trust those instincts and trust the fact that you will be able to work with your child. To give you an example, you don't have to be a quantum physicist to help your child to understand quantum physics. I know because I have actually helped a child to learn quantum physics, and I don't understand a bit of it. But what I do understand, as every parent does, is how to read through information, how to translate that information into easier to understand language, and how to look up the answers in the back of the book. I also know how to contact somebody if I don't know the answer, to encourage a child to research, to help that child to develop their understanding. In other words, the parent can facilitate the child's learning without necessarily having that subject specific understanding. And it works wonderfully well, because what happens is the parent develops understanding. 15 years ago, I didn't even know what a rock cycle was until I had a child who decided to study geology. I now know how to analyze rocks, and I know what the rock cycle is. So you're actually developing your abilities, and you can trust yourself to do that because your brain will expand as you work with your child. So the first thing is trust yourself. So what's the next point? Well, who's the most important person in the relationship? It isn't a school teacher, it isn't a social worker, it isn't the local authority officer, and actually it isn't you, it's your child. Your home education is about your child. Something about your child is telling you that they need a different form of education to that which they've got, or if you're starting from a preschool age, that actually sending them to school isn't going to be right for them. And home education might well be. And so you listen to your child, you look at your child, you understand your child, you trust your child to be able to tell you what their needs are, and trusting your child to do what is right for your child. They're not inanimate objects. It's not like your dog who you need to take for a walk 3 times a day and feed at certain times, because sometimes that child might not be hungry for information at that point. Sometimes they might want more information at that point. And the child wants to learn. Inherently, human beings need to learn. They need to get information because we are by nature creatures who want to know more about our surroundings. And children are no different. And children are like sponges for information. They want to know. I can remember my mother saying to me when I was very little, I was sent home from school with a note from my mother telling her that I was causing trouble in the classroom because I won't stop asking why. And my mother said, well, the world absolutely revolves around those who ask why. And children want to know why. They want to ask you. And you've got to trust them to ask about what they want to know. So where does that lead us? If you've got a child in school who doesn't want to go, they're registered in school, they don't want to go, they're telling you they're being bullied, they're telling you they're miserable, they've got obvious anxieties, there is something not right. Talk to them, listen to them, ask them what they want to do. Center your decisions around your child. Ask your child how they want to be educated. Trust your child to tell you. If they can't articulate it, talk to them about what their options are. If you've got a little 5-year-old who's saying to you, tractors, tractors, everything is tractors, the whole world is tractors. Next week it might be jellyfish or squirrels. But right now, that's what your child's interest is. So right now, tractors are what your child has to learn about. Trust your child to know what they want to learn. And if that child, and I have had one who was obsessed with roller coasters, you can trust me to tell you that I know more about roller coasters than I've ever wanted to know, because that child wanted to know about roller coasters. And actually, having researched roller coasters, read about roller coasters, spoken to companies that produce roller coasters, he's now pretty much an expert on roller coaster engineering and has still a sort of inkling ambition that that might be where he goes. Because as a family, we trusted him to know what he needed at that point. So if your child is saying to you, tractors, 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 why would you want to say to the child, today we're going to learn about Romans? In school, that's what happens. In school, the child will have set lessons. This term, children, we are going to learn about Romans. Set lessons in a set classroom with a set number of children. Home education frees you from that and enables to trust your child to tell you what they want to learn. So if your child says to you, I want to learn about Egypt, I'll give you a lovely example of a child who said that to her mum. She wanted to learn about Egypt. Now, in a school, children will learn about Egypt. They might well. They'll learn about ancient Egypt. They might touch on Tutankhamun. they might touch on what the Egyptians wore. They'll certainly learn about pyramids. But this child wanted to actually learn about Egypt, not just pick around the outskirts of it. And so she made herself Egyptian clothing with the help of her mum, and she wore Egyptian clothing in the house. During the period she was learning about Egypt, the family ate Egyptian food, ancient Egyptian food, modern Egyptian food. They learnt about it. They read about the culture of Egypt. They read about how that culture developed. They read fiction about historical characters in Egypt. They read fiction about modern characters in Egypt. They read biographies of famous people in Egypt. They immersed themselves in Egypt. And by the end of that session, how this child did it, I do not know, because it is so far above my own capabilities. But that child actually created a computer program to write in hieroglyphics. Now, that child wouldn't have had that opportunity if the parent hadn't trusted the child to know what the child wanted. And as the child was coming to the end of their absolute need to know about Egypt, so the parent listened to the child to move on to the next subject. I believe that somebody had their hand up. No? Gone.
No, I don't think so. I think it was just saying that's a great,
yeah. Okay.
what a great point.
And that child, I can tell you what that child moved on to next. That child moved on to bears, polar bears, and how the environment is working, the interaction of climate change and wildlife, mainly concentrating on bears. And that child is a very, very well-rounded little girl. I followed her for years, and she's not an unusual child from home education. She's actually the child that I meet every time I meet home educated children, children whose parents are allowing them the freedom. Freedom is what home education is about. The parent is allowing the child the freedom to choose where they want to be, to focus on what they need, and that trust in the child absolutely shines. So where does that take us? Because you've got other people who are in this relationship. Now, one of the problems we have is that there is a lot of misunderstanding about the relationship between the parent and child and the local authority and public bodies. And we cannot actually allow that to be misunderstood. We've got to accept, and this is another point of trust, legally, the local authority has some involvement with home education. But that is because legally they are tasked with actually overseeing whether or not the parent is performing their legal duty correctly. Now, the legal duty of the parent who's providing a home education is to provide an education that's suitable to the child's age, ability, aptitude, and any special needs that they have. That is why you've got to trust your child. If you send your child to school, the school just provides a national curriculum, or an independent school or academy will provide a broad and balanced curriculum. But you've got to do much more. You've got to provide your child with an individualized curriculum. That's where you've got to trust yourself and your child, because you need to know what that child as an individual wants. So if you don't know that, you can't comply with the law. So we have to accept that the local authority does have a role, and that's a role in oversight of whether or not you're fulfilling your duty. That's a really difficult task, because, as a local authority officer said to me recently, every time I go through the door of a home educating family's house, and this local authority officer does that frequently because they have a very good relationship, and so they are welcomed. She said, every time I get to the door, I take a deep breath, and I have to empty my mind, because I've got to go into that house and see every single child as an individual. I really liked that, because that is precisely what the local authority is required to do. Every single child is an individual. And it's really, really hard for a parent to trust the local authority to get that right. And it's really, really hard because actually a lot of local authorities don't trust parents. So we need to look at why that happens and how we can challenge that. Excuse me. So why don't they trust us? Why don't local authorities trust families? Some years ago, local authorities did trust families. I've been doing this for 40 years. 40 years ago, the local authority officer would be more likely to say to you, "Oh, hello, what are you doing? What are you doing? Oh, that looks good. How do you do that?" Rather than trying to tick a box on a form that they've got to take back to their office and upload into their computer. And then Graham Badman came along. Who was Graham Badman? He was a man charged with investigating whether or not home education needed regulation. Graham Badman had a rather jaded view of home education, and home educators as a whole came together. We're not a single community, we're a disparate number of individuals who have individualistic choices. But we came together and we challenged the nonsense that was out there. But that nonsense was picked up, and that nonsense has followed us for many years now. The nonsense that home educators are abusive, the nonsense that the state is responsible for our child's welfare, whereas actually it's a reactive duty. The state has a reactive duty to act if we are not properly caring for our children, and that includes properly educating our children. But the narrative was picked up by the media. The narrative was expanded, and the narrative has followed us and dogged us for years now, more than a decade. And that narrative has fed into this fear, the fear that we are somehow different, that we are somehow not quite right, and in fact, that we are somehow abhorrent. Now, I talk to home education officers on a regular basis. I talk to them, I do professional development with them, and I know that most of those individual officers do not view home educators in that way. Very, very often, this is coming down from management, it's coming down from government. There are cases where home education officers are actually pretty appalling, but they're not the norm. And these people are telling me that they want to be able to work with parents, but they are not trusted by the government or by their senior managers to actually do that in the way that they feel is right. And it's really hard sometimes for home educators to understand that the individual officer may well be under pressure and suffering that same lack of trust. It's like Skittles. You've got your child who needs to be trusted by the parent, and the parent who needs to be trusted by the education officer. And sometimes, where they're good officers, they're not necessarily trusted by their managers. And at the top of that tree, you've got the ministers who, in 2015, the then minister on Christmas Eve announced to the press that we were radicalising our children. We've had announcements made that home educators are actually genitally mutilating their children. We've been told that we are failing them, that our children are feral, all of these things. It's really hard to trust public bodies when that's the sort of thing they say about us, isn't it? So how do we actually develop relationships that get around that point? Well, we need to work from both sides. One of the things that I very much stress when we're doing professional development is the three things that were said to me by education officers. I did a research project for the Minister on positive practice quite recently. And for that, I interviewed education officers who parents had told me were good people, who cared about the children, who were respectful. And I was interested to see that although they were interviewed separately, every single one of them said three things to me. And that is that it's really important to develop mutual trust, mutual respect, and for the parent to feel safe to speak to them. Now, if the education officer is saying to you, if you do not do this, I am going to punish you, how are you going to trust that individual? You can't. But if that education officer is saying to you, look, I want to listen to you, would you mind meeting with me? Not, I'm going to come to your door and I'm going to see you and you better be in, or if you don't, I'll assume that you're not engaging with me. And we see letters that say that. What that education officer should be doing is showing you that they are trusting you, demonstrating to you that they are respecting you. And they should be saying to you, look, I'd really like to talk to you about your child. I'd really like to know what the education is like. They have to fulfill their duty. That duty requires them, in every single case of every child, to make an inquiry, to ascertain what the form of education is. So they have to have that initial inquiry when they're first aware of you. So if somebody says to you, if you do not meet me, I am going to prosecute you, you're going to say, tough luck, mate, I'm not going to meet you, because you know you cannot trust that person. But if that education officer says to you, I'd really love to meet you, but if that's not convenient, please let me know how you'd like me to communicate with you. Immediately, you feel more positively inclined to dealing with that person. And if you do meet that person or talk to that person, or however you communicate with that person, and their response to you is encouraging and supportive and trusting and respectful, then your relationship with that person, if you have to have a relationship going forward, is going to be a much more positive relationship. And it's more child-centric because your child doesn't have your time wasted dealing with what can be deeply unpleasant communication. You don't have the stress of that, and the officer ticks their box and actually goes home feeling they've done a good job. So we look at this, and that trust comes right from the start, from the very decision you make, right through to the people you're dealing with. Now that brings us to public bodies. What's happening with our public bodies? In Northern Ireland, the same thing that's happening here, was happening a few years ago. Parents can't be trusted. Parents must be policed. We've got to get into their houses. We've got to meet them. We've got to make sure that we see their children. Our job is to listen to their child's voice. We need to police. We need to regulate. These abhorrent educators. They're doing something that's not quite right. That was the attitude. It's what parents tell us they feel that our Department for Education's attitude is to them. I don't believe it is, but that's how parents feel. And that happened in Northern Ireland, and parents were so aggrieved that parents went to jail rather than comply with what was asked of them. That's how strongly parents felt. That's how hurt and aggrieved parents felt. So what did they do? They didn't make the punishment even harder to try and prevent that. They didn't ridicule the parents who said that they'd rather go to jail, as somebody in the House of Lords did to our parents. They changed their guidance. They changed the guidance to make clear that when a parent has no concerns raised about them, then the education department has no interest in asking them about the education. But if somebody raises a concern, then they will have professional curiosity, they will investigate, and they will act. And that's actually what the law says that they should do. Now, I don't know how we persuade our public bodies that that's what we need to do. But what I do know is that fighting, confrontation isn't working. So let's take us back to the beginning. It's really, really hard as a parent if your local authority is not actually acting as it should do. It's really hard to address that because, as people say, I could bump down here. Shall I shove my head above the parapet? Should I make myself clear? Should I be the one who stands up and is counted? And it's really hard to stand up and be counted, for your head to be above the parapet, because we all know whoever's head's above the parapet is the one who gets shot. So it's really, really hard. So how do you work with this? You do what parents have done in many areas of the country. You actually get together with other local home educators and you say, look, what are we upset about? What are we concerned about? You don't aggressively attack the local authority officer because, quite frankly, poor old Fred, who's in the local authority, may well have been told by his bosses that he's got to send a standard letter out that is really quite offensive, and he's been trying to work to persuade his bosses that that's not nice. So don't take out your aggression on him. Join together, trust each other to work together. It's hard, but we have to do it. We are all on the same side. Your neighbour who home educates isn't trying to stab you in the back. They're not trying to harm you. And we always fear as human beings that somebody is trying to hurt us because inherently we've got to protect ourselves. That's our animal instinct. So take a deep breath and say, look, shall we work together on this? Come together as a local community because there is power in your community. You have the power. You can trust each other to work to change things. So what do? You ask the local authority to meet with you. Politely, you remind them that actually meeting with you is a good thing and they're advised to do it. You talk to the local authority openly and you say to them, look, what you're doing is actually causing us distress. This isn't working. And I can tell you an exact sentence the local authority officer said to me. When I first started work X number of years ago, I went to see a man who asked if he could talk to me about what was happening. And he showed me the letters that we had sent. And I knew that I was never going to hurt a parent like that. That officer had actually seen for themselves because a parent had asked them to look. So highlight to your local authority what it is that makes you not want to trust them, what it is that makes you feel negatively about them. You don't have to invite them into your home and give them cake and coffee if that's not your choice. But you do have to have some relationship with them because of the way the law works. And if that relationship can be a mutually trusting relationship, it's going to be easier for you going forward. Because then, say for example, you've got a problem, you cannot get in contact with the school nurse, or you think your child might need an EHCP. Getting an EHCP for a home educated child isn't easy in a lot of areas. Who can you actually go to? If you trust your local authority officer and if their conduct is respectful of you, then you're going to ask them for help. If your ex-partner is threatening to take your child away from you because you're home educating the child and suddenly after all the years of approving it, they disapprove of it, who might be your best ally? You go into a courtroom, a good report from your local authority officer actually will help you. So if those local authority officers will take a step back and listen to you and trust you and your neighbours to develop positive relationships, it can become a two-way program of where you can actually get them to help you where necessary. And when I talk to really good local authority officers, I know that there are some who, for example, will go to battle with children's social services who don't understand home education. They will tell the social worker that actually, I do not have concerns about this child's education, so why are you bringing it up? So this whole idea of the essentials, it comes down to taking that step into the dark. Let's take it back to the parent. You're stood there, your little child, your little girl or your little boy. Children are always called Fred for me. So little Fred might be a girl or a boy, I don't care. Little Fred has come out of the school playground. There are tears rolling down his or her face, and he says to you, or she says to you, "Mummy, please don't ever make me go back to school again." That happens. 40 years ago, my little girl, when I woke her up, said to me, "Mummy, please don't ever make me go back to school again." That makes me have goosebumps even now. And what did I say to her? I said to her, "Of course not, sweetheart. Now I can tell you, I didn't even know that home education was legal. I didn't even know whether or not I could do it, but I knew that I trusted my child to know what was right for her, and I knew that no way was I going to send that little girl back to school again. And I came to home education purely because I trusted my instincts as a parent, and I trusted my child to know what was best. And that little girl opened my eyes to what was happening to children in that school. I found out what was happening to children in that school. Schools are not necessarily the safe places that safeguard our children, where children will go and responsible professionals will make sure that they're fine. That isn't happening. In fact, I know from the Children's Society that our children are amongst the unhappiest in Europe, and that a lot of that happiness stems from school. Not because teachers don't want to do a good job, but because they don't have the resources, the time, or the facility to do so. So my little girl wanted me to trust her. I can tell you what I did. As a legal professional, we didn't have computers 40 years ago. I dashed off to my big tome of a law book and I looked through for an Education Act and I thought, thank goodness, I'm not breaking the law. I can home educate my child. I didn't have a clue how I was going to do it. Just as you, when your little boy or girl says to you, they want to home educate, or you think, I'd really like to home educate, you probably don't have a clue how, but you need to trust yourself to find your way to do it the right way for your child as an individual, the way that suits your family as a whole. And I've home educated several children, my children, I've home educated my grandchildren, and I've supported other parents in their home education, including tutoring children over the years to help them, to support them. And I know that every single child is different, and my children have all been autonomously home educated. Now, I don't mean that they've all been unschooled, which means basically you don't actually provide them with formal input at all. I don't mean that, because autonomous means you listen to the child and the child chooses where it goes. And I've had, amongst the children I've home educated, those who want to do bookwork, formal work, all of the time, to the point where I'm pretty much fed up with it. But that's what they want. So I trusted that child to know what they wanted. I've had another child I can remember, the same little girl who 40 years ago brought me to home education. I can remember her saying to me one evening, "How do tithes work, Mummy?" So I said, "Okay, go to sleep, go to bed, and I'll get you up a bit later and we'll go and see." And at midnight, we were stood hand in hand in the sea, looking at the moon and talking about how tides work. That little girl is now a professional woman. I know that home education works, and I never told her what she wanted to learn. Right from the very start, I trusted her to tell me what she needed to learn. And that little girl, she hated maths. Gosh, does that. As an adult, she hates maths. Numbers, she just cannot bear numbers. So we didn't bother doing numbers until we absolutely had to. We absolutely had to because she decided one day she wanted to get a maths GCSE. So the only way that she could do that was for us to do lots and lots of old maths papers until she could actually get it. She never did actually get it, but we got her to the point that if you did one a couple of hours before an exam, she could walk in and pass it. But what she wanted to do is learn about what interested her. And that little girl learnt motor mechanics. She was a tiny little scrap of a girl, but she wanted to be able to do motor mechanics. She learnt photography. She went and did classes with Terry Pratchett, who is a well-known author. She learnt to be a riding instructor. And I didn't even know by the time she was 14 what she intended to be, because she changed her mind. She wanted to be a photographer, she wanted to be a writer, she wanted to be a car mechanic, and she wanted to be a riding instructor. And each time she developed an interest, I trusted her to know what she really wanted, and I supported her. I didn't teach her, I supported her to learn because I had to trust her. Now, that little girl never became a motor mechanic or a writer or anything else on the list of things I've given to you. She actually entered the law as a profession. But it doesn't matter, because at the time that she wanted to be a motor mechanic, that was what she needed. So when your child tells you, I want to be a tractor driver, take them to look at tractors. Teach them about tractors, buy them toy tractors, get them to go and meet a tractor mechanic. Do everything tractors. If for 3 months all you do is tractors until tractors are coming out of your ears, that's the right thing for your child. And one of the ladies I've helped over the years has a child who spent nearly 3 years obsessed with bus timetables. I cannot imagine 3 years of a child being obsessed with bus timetables, but she supported him. And that little boy actually had all of his education based on bus timetables. How did he do that? How do you get a wide education from bus timetables? Dead easy. You've got to read the bus timetables, haven't you? You can make calculations from bus timetables. You can check what type of bus goes where. How is that bus made? Where do they get the parts from? How do you learn to be a bus driver? What type of people become bus drivers? How do bus drivers go to the toilet? That's a good question. I've been asked that one. How do bus drivers know what's comfortable to wear? Where is the bus going? What happens where the bus is going? Why do the people get on the bus to go there? What are they going to see? And just in those few questions, which are minimal, you've got numeracy, you've got literacy, you've got biology, you've got geography, you've got sociology, you've got a wide range of lessons. As I say to people, anything, absolutely anything, trust your child to learn. Pick up the nearest object on my desk. You can't see what that is very clearly. It's a little bear. What's that bear made of, Mummy? It's called basalt. What's basalt? Basalt is a rock. Oh, where does it come from? Not every child will act like that, but you know your own child and you know how to interact with your own child. And actually, that little bear ended up with a discussion with our little 3-year-old grandchild only very recently on the difference between an igneous rock and a metamorphic rock, and how rocks are everywhere and where they come from, and how people travel to Iceland. So just a little little black stone bear. And that 3-year-old now understands metamorphic and igneous rocks, in so much as a 3-year-old needs to or wants to understand metamorphic and igneous rocks. Why does he understand that? Because he needed to know, and he trusted me. And what a privilege that was, that that little boy trusted me to know the answer or to help him to find the answer. And I trusted him to hear and understand and to let me know when it was enough for him to learn. And that little boy, just like his big brother and just like his aunties and uncles and just like all of the other children whose education I've been involved in, will grow up to be a child who, like other home educated children, actually loves to learn. Your child wants to learn and loves to learn the very, very essentials. What I'm here to talk to you about today is the essentials. The essentials are, you want the best for your child, and your child loves to learn. And you, as a parent, need to trust in yourself, you need to trust in your child, and we need to continue battling to develop trust in us from public bodies. We need to help them to learn that we're not those monsters. We're not abhorrent. We are mums, dads, grandmas, granddads, and sometimes big brothers and sisters and aunties and uncles who are choosing to trust our children and develop their love of learning. And I think that that is the most basic, essential point that we can have. Now, there are 10 minutes left, and if anybody would like to ask me a question, please do. Anything.
Oh gosh, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Wendy. That's such a rich, such rich content there. I think it's one of those things I wish everyone would be able to hear that as they start or before they start home educating. So that's incredible. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Please do. If people want to have discussions when you're thinking about home education, and I'm the chair of education otherwise, we have a helpline. All of our volunteers on the helpline have got experience, they're trained. Ring us. We will talk to you about how you do this. We will help you. We can't come and work with you side to side physically, but we'll hold your hand and help you get through and make those decisions that are right for you. We're happy to listen to you and to talk to you, so please do. That helpline is 0300 124 5690. Please do ring us if you'd like to talk to us. Sometimes you'll get me, but not always.
Fantastic. And how else can people get in contact with you if they like to chat to you about anything?
Yes, they can, on that number, they can get in touch. Alternatively, they can email on enquiries, that's ENQUIRIES, at educationotherwise.org. And we will always respond to inquiries. If you don't hear from us, please do try again. The phone lines can be quite busy with volunteers, but we are there. We're open from 10 o'clock till 6 o'clock every weekday, and in theory from 10 till 2 on Saturdays, not on Sundays, but people do call at other times, and if I'm here, I will pick up the phone. I pick up the phone out of hours, and if I'm available and at my desk, I will talk to you.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Wendy. I think one of the things that I've just been kind of getting over the last couple of days is just how much the government actually, all the rhetoric that comes out makes you doubt yourself as a parent. I don't think I'd quite connected the dots, the fact that, there's a natural kind of reticence and kind of, oh, how am I going to cope with this? But it's fed all the time by the government narrative that parenting is this kind of really difficult thing that you can't possibly do on your own, that you need help, and that you can't do it on your own. And we're fed that narrative. And I think one of the sessions, I think Joanna was in it as well, was Harriet Pattison, just unpacking that and just explaining, you know, very many of the ways that that the government has done that. And it's led to kind of a generation who doubt their own abilities. But parenting is a very natural thing. And, you know, and you do rise in confidence as you go on, as you see how your children are responding. And I think it's just, that's a very, very key thing. So thank you for just kind of adding to the debate.
Absolutely. And actually, a few years ago, I was asked about this, and I wrote an article and explaining to parents in very simple terms what's happened and what's happened over the years. And I'll synopsize it because I don't want to run over. But when my parents were young, the government actually didn't intervene with parenting. You had people who would punish you if you did something wrong, but you know, if you decided to thrash your child or your child was neglected, there was very little that happened. Victorian times, you had worthies who, the wealthy women would do charitable causes to support the more vulnerable. And from that, when it came to my generation, we had what we used to refer to as the cruelty man. And that was somebody who, it was essentially children's social services. But if somebody told somebody that a child was being really badly abused, then they would step in to help. By the time my children were young, in the 1970s, that had come to the development of children's social services. And children's social services were a reactive organisation which was about giving support to children who were actually subject to harm from their parents. And that was, to me, a very good thing to have, because where a child was being harmed, somebody cared and somebody was there to pick up the pieces. But over the years, that's changed. And part of the change is driven by children's social services, because it was, at the time, it was one of the few well-paid jobs that women could get into where they were respected. And so social services was fueled. You have to develop the job role in order to develop the job opportunities in order to expand what you're doing. And in the 1970s, there was a policy shift from reacting to actually promoting in advance childcare, offering advice to parents who are actually not doing anything wrong, rather than reacting to times when things were pretty bad. And what came from that was the development of children's centres, proactively actually trying to meet with children in advance of anything being a problem. And my children would think, oh well, you know, if we've got a problem, we can go to the social workers. Then I talked to my adult grandchildren. One of my adult grandchildren said to me, well, of course parents can't make that decision. It needs a professional to help them to make that decision. And I said to her, she was training as a social worker, and I said to her, sweetheart, think back what you've just said. Oh my God, they've indoctrinated me, she said. And it suddenly occurred to her, she'd come out with this line about parents cannot decide for their children. Parents need a professional to tell them what is right. And actually, parents have been parenting ever since Neolithic man. We might not have always got it right, and we need somebody there to pick up the pieces when we get it wrong. But we need to be trusted to be parents, and we cannot listen to the narrative of, you can't do this on your own, parents need support. We've got to feed back to them. Actually, I know Fred better than you do.
Yeah, that's right. And I think as well, I always used to think, well, thinking about health visitors and, you know, that time when my children were little, but the advice that was given, it almost changed on an annual basis. You know, we had 7 children in 9 years. And I mean, by the time we got to the last couple, you know, I just stopped them coming, because I knew myself that I knew what I was doing. And you know, I mean, we had one of ours that just dropped off all the scales, but I knew that he was sleeping well, he was eating, he was contented, you know. So I wasn't, I couldn't care less. I mean, obviously I didn't want him to, but you know, I just, yeah, I just realised that actually they're told what to say as well, and that changes kind of, you know, from year to year. So actually, you do know your child best, and you know, even professionals, you know, don't necessarily, they're not the professionals in your child, are they?
Exactly. And the education officer needs you to teach them. They need you to educate them about your child. They can give pointers. A good education officer will be supportive. And if somebody's got concerns or if they're not quite sure about their education, a good education officer will say, oh, right, okay, have you tried going to this group? Or have you tried this? Or, oh, one of the mums I spoke to did this. Or one of the dads I spoke to, when he had this problem, he did this. You could try that. That's really respectful. And I talk to education officers who do that. But at the same time, I know there are those who, if you said to them, oh, I'm not quite sure how to do numeracy with my child, will say, bang, section 437. And we've got to develop that trust. And we develop that trust by empowering ourselves, by telling people, actually, take a step back here because I'm the expert in my child. And I think we need to trust ourselves, really trust ourselves to understand that.
That's one of the things I've loved about your presentation, Wendy, is that bit about engaging with the local authority, and then, but particularly around that being a community that engages with them as well, and that coming together. And I've, that's one of the things that's one of my takeaways, is that actually how do we come together, no matter how we home educate, how do we, yeah, how do we do that together, and challenge when necessary, but also we want that, like you're saying, it's like a two-way street. Trust is a two-way street, and so, and then that helps everybody because it helps them do their job, and then they can help us home educate. So I wrote that was one of my takeaways.
Yep. Locally to me, that's a big takeaway. Locally to me, we had really poor relationships, and we went in at the ground floor and we sat together and we talked and we discussed why the relationships were poor. And Education Otherwise runs a KIT award, and the KIT award for excellence for home education officers. And that came from my local home education officer, who took over and turned it around. And all across the area where I work now, there's a consortium of education staff, and every single one of them is respected, caring, trusting. And it's because somebody went in at the bottom, that tiny cluster of parents went in and said, look, you've got to help us to make this change. And KIT actually was a gentleman called Richard, the KIT award, and Richard just said, yes, you're right, how are we going to change this? And the amount of trust he showed in those families encouraged them to give that trust back. And working together collaboratively, we now have, across this area, if somebody's got a problem, they'll ring up and they say, I mean, it's Joe now. Joe, you know, X has happened. I'm not quite sure how to deal with it. I've rung Joe and I've said, oh, you know, some of the parents are having trouble accessing computers. Leave it with me, Wendy. And those parents got access to the computer room at the library on a weekly basis for as long as they needed it. And that's how relationships should work. And if we trust each other, that's how they do work. But I don't want to run over into the next session. So if anyone's got any questions, you've got our contact details. Please do contact me. I've been doing this for 40 years, so I know a little bit about it. I'm never going to be the expert in your child, but I can tell you what I know.
Yeah. Oh, Wendy, I could listen to you all day. It's amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving your time up for this. And yeah, make sure that that number and that email, people take that down. Just yeah, thank you so much. It's been great to speak to you.
Enjoy the rest of the conference. I'll be live tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Fantastic. Okay.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.